Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. And on this video we're going to put together the front end, which is a Dana 44 out of a Rubicon. So we'll just go over some reassembly. Alright, so let's get them assembled. Now when you put your knuckle back on, it has a bushing in there so they can adjust your front end a little bit. And when you put those bushings back in, you'll see here that there's a flat on the one side of the bushing, and it just lines up with the casting right there. So you can only really put it in one way. All right, so we'll get these on. We'll get everything on. Obviously, we won't put the axles in yet, so we can get it tightened up. Now I'm just going to run the nuts up. Ultimately, they're going to be torqued to 55 foot-pounds. So we'll take their procedure. And their procedure is torque the bottom to 15, and then torque the top to 55. Alright, so another reason to put anti-seize or some kind of lube on your bolts is when you're torquing something down, a lube bolt torques differently and more accurately torques down than the dry one. 15 really isn't much. So then we'll go 55 on the top. Okay, there's 55. It's kind of a question whether or not we're going to get there. So we're going to have to back up just a little bit on the top to get to the key. And there's 55. And I like to bend them around just so they're not just hanging out there. Alright, so there's this side. The front axle disconnects only on 2018 and newer JLs, JTs, and it's on both the Rubicons, the Sports, and Sierras. It's a way to disconnect this front shaft so it ain't spinning. So we got to get these cleaned up, but the FAD has this collar that slides in here, and what happens, the shaft is piloted, so they're piloted within each other, and then it shifts this collar back and forth. Alright, so the FAD, what it'll do is it'll ride on the shaft, and then once you engage it, it'll shift over and it connects the inner and the outer shafts. So without the coupler, if you were to forget to put this coupler in and you had a one-piece shaft, well, it would just shift back and forth with that one-piece axle. You wouldn't necessarily have to delete it and delete all your and undo your programming. Alright, so to get this thing together, since one pilots into the other, eventually there'll be gear lube in there, but to get it started, we're just going to anti-seize the end of it just a little bit. We'll push it through into the pilot, and then you got to get the FAD onto the shaft. And then it'll pilot into the other shaft. It'll slide over and it'll connect the two shafts. Black RTV on there. and it's lined up by these couple dowels. Let's put it over the ring. I did put just a little bit of anti-seize on it because it's going to be used a little bit before that grease gets going. Line up the dowel pins. Since this one's got to go through the seal, and try to do this without turning it much. Alright, so let's get the hubs on. Now before you put your hubs back in, just run around them with a wire brush. There's a lot of corrosion on these things, and that's from interacting with the aluminum. So just go through and wire brush these. Don't use solvent because it'll get in your bearings. But something's interesting about these. So that's off of a Dana 44 front, and that one's off of a Dana 30 front. Now the Dana 31 fits in the hub. It fits the stub shafts, so I'll have to check and see if the stub shafts are the same, but the hub off the Dana 30 is definitely the same off as the 44. Something to keep in mind if you ever break down, they don't have one for a 44, see if they've got one for a 30. When I bought this, I found one in Tennessee and ended up not being the hub after all, so that's why I kept it. Let's get these hubs in. So as usual, and since these splines actually don't run in and out, and more importantly, this inner bore on your knuckle, especially since it's aluminum, put a little bit on the hub too. Don't get too much on the flange, but that bore definitely. And when you do this, make sure your sensor is up. So your sensor will be on the back side here. Remember, these are the multi-points, and then 75 foot-pounds. Alright, so we're going to put the axle nuts on, and we're going to torque those to 100 foot-pounds. Now, I've seen some things that say never reuse the nuts. Some things it doesn't say anything about it at all. But this is a 36 millimeter. Alright, so there's the axle nuts. Alright, so now it's time to plug the locker plug in. I'm going to put a little of this dielectric grease in that plug. That's made for electrical connections. Put a little bit on the O-ring. So if you do this, make sure you're using a dielectric grease. It'll tell you on it that it's made for used for electrical insulation and plugs. Don't just use any grease. Remember, there's an O-ring on here, so that'll go in. And the hard part is just getting it on the catch. That's in. And we just, it's a little 10mm. These have that rubber seal on the diff cover. We're just going to wipe it out and bolt it on. So the only thing left is put the backers on. That was 3 screws each. And then the caliper mounts, you have these 2 here. And then once you get it on, we'll use factory calipers. And then we had the drilled and slotted rotors, those returned. So pulling your axles are fairly easy. You'll need a pick or fork to knock the knuckles off. And for the lowers, I had to shorten the fork because you couldn't get it into the lower. So if anything, if you gotta take these off, go buy a cheap Harbor Freight fork and just grind the ears off. But from there, it's just put your tie rod on, connect your drag link and everything. But if it's already in, after your tie rod gets put back on and your drag link, you're pretty much done. The axles are an easy pull. And if you have a Rubicon, just plug your lockers back in. Make sure if you do have your axle out, you hook the vent tubes back up. So if you enjoy stuff like this, stick around on the channel. We've got the rear to put back together. Check out some of our other videos. I'll see you in those. It's another edition of Jeepingmo. Please remember to subscribe.